So, hello and welcome to this latest Q&A. This one coincides with another huge milestone. The channel has just reached 250,000 subscribers. As ever, I'm incredibly grateful to everyone who supports the channel by subscribing, liking, commenting, or sharing. And as always, I'm particularly grateful to the channel members. Their regular support means a huge amount to me. Thanks so much to all of you. And with that, now on to the questions. So, Doug Calabresi asks, will Europe be able to effectively unite and support Ukraine and its territorial integrity without US support? And what would be the impact of a complete US withdrawal of aid, and how can Ukraine prepare for this? So, Doug, thanks so much for this question, because obviously this is one of the most important questions that I think we're dealing with in contemporary international relations. I mean, we've seen how everything has been upended in the 2 months since Donald Trump was sworn in as US president. And we know at the moment that there is a US push for some sort of peace agreement, ceasefire, maybe then pushing on to a peace agreement. And I think a lot of people are asking this question that if it becomes apparent that what the United States is pushing for is completely unacceptable, then it will have to be the case that some very difficult decisions are made. And most obviously, that would potentially mean, could Europe take up the slack? And if Ukraine wants to fight on, that Europe would be able to provide the support that Ukraine needs. Now, look, one thing I would say, and I often make this point, is that, look, I'm not a military science person by background, so I don't, I'm not going to pretend to hold forth on sort of what sort of military equipment Ukraine would need and what its aircraft capabilities are or aren't or anything like that. So I will just park that. There are other channels which talk a lot about that sort of thing, and I think a far better place to talk about it than I am. But what I would say in a general sense is that my feeling is yes, but it wouldn't be easy. We know that much. But I think from what I've been able to understand, that Europe would be able to provide a lot of the military support, but it wouldn't be immediate. So what it would effectively mean doing is sort of coming up with a number of strategies to mitigate the loss of any particular US support in certain areas. And I think one thing that really is very clear about all of this is that even if the US cuts off its support, we have to think, what exactly that means in real terms. Is that a decision that Trump says, I have a fundamental ideological opposition to helping Ukraine? Maybe that's because he wants to pursue a closer relationship with Russia and believes that can't be done while he's supporting Ukraine, or simply saying, I, as part of my cost savings, I cannot justify this support any longer to the US taxpayer. And the reason I say that this is important is because in many ways, it then determines how Europe could respond. So if it's an ideological, the US says, right, okay, I am going to privilege the relationship with Vladimir Putin over what would effectively become former US partners in Europe. And he will not provide any US support whatsoever, including intelligence support, then that's a very different situation. And that will provide, from what I've been able to tell, gaps that will be very, very difficult to fix in the immediate term. It's not something that can't be managed, but it will take longer. And the question is, how much time would Ukraine have? But if it's more a case that Trump then turns around and says, well, I'm not going to support this anymore because US taxpayers can't be expected to foot the bill. And especially if that's tied in with the failure of any peace, process that then would come down to be blamed on Russia. Then I think that, we're in a very different position, because then Europe could turn around to the United States and say, all right, we will provide the bulk of the costs on this, or we will provide all the costs on this, but we do need to have your support in certain areas. Can we still buy that equipment from the United States? And I think that is a very, very different type of debate. It would also tie in very much with an issue that I've touched on a few times, which is the question of whether the European Union will seize Russian assets. This has been a really, really important debate that we've seen evolving, and it seems that more and more European governments are falling into line over that. And that could be a huge sum of money. We're talking hundreds of billions of dollars. That then would be freed up. Now, I think the overall aim would be a lot of that would go, the aim would be to give it to Ukraine, but that could be used to purchase US weapons. But in those areas where Europe doesn't have the capability of producing a particular weapon system, that might then become an attractive incentive for the United States, that, for example, the European countries could go and say, listen, okay, we understand that you don't want US taxpayers to support this, but do you really want to cut off all US defense industry supplies to Ukraine? This is worth a lot of money to the United States. We are willing to pay for that. So I think that what we would see is a very, very different type of debate emerging about how Europe could support Ukraine in the event that the US did cut off support. But of course, if that were to be the case, then it would also throw open a whole range of other questions that I'll touch on in another question about how the relationship between Europe and the United States will develop from there. But certainly, I think my initial reaction is Europe would be able to continue to support Ukraine in the event that US pulled its support. It would be difficult. There would be very obvious gaps from what I've been able to understand, but those are things that with a little bit of time could be filled in. I think one last thing I would say, which I think would also be absolutely crucial in any of this, is in terms of how the US reacts. If it's about the United States taking the ideological position and supporting Russia and opening up the US economy, dropping sanctions on Russia, then I think Europe will find itself in a very, very difficult position, because I think at the moment, one of the things that seems to be coming out is that, the Russian economy is taking a huge hit, and that with a continuation of that pressure, that within, a lot of the forecasts, now I know there will be people scoffing, saying this is Western propaganda and all the rest of it, but it does seem that a lot of the forecasts say that within the next 12 to 18 months, the Russian economy will feel this in a huge way, and that there will be all sorts of knock-on effects to this. Now, if the United States were to lift sanctions on Russia, for example, and start trading, that would provide a lifeline, which would allow Russia to be able to fight this war for a lot longer. So that will be also a hugely important moment in all of this. And as I say, if the United States were to offer Russia that lifeline, I think that would have a devastating effect on the relationship between the United States and Europe, because Europe will be forced to tighten up those sanctions and start to think very seriously about what other measures it can introduce. So I think there's a whole range of other questions that are tied up with this question about how you can deal with Ukraine in the event that United States, as I say, pulls its support. And it will so much depend on how the framing of pulling that support is. As I say, whether it's a question that it wants to say, right, okay, we actually now support Russia, we believe that they are the good guys in this whole scenario, or whether it's simply saying we've had enough of both Russia and Ukraine, we can't do anything more, but we'll pull our support, but we're happy to supply support, but on a financial basis. Generic name person asks, what's the path back for the United States and a transatlantic alliance if there was a large shift in the country's political gravity in 2027 or 2029? How much ground could realistically be regained after 2 more years of this administration? Really, really great question, because again, I mean, this is very much tied to the previous question. So much will depend on how we see the United States developing its policies in the next weeks, months, and maybe next year or so. This is obviously something that I think is on a lot of people's minds. And I still get the sense that despite all the problems that we're seeing with Trump at the moment, there is a large body of thought in Europe that still believes that it's, in some sense, this is salvageable. That what we're seeing at the moment is obviously extremely worrying. That I'm recording this just as the news has broken about this absolutely unbelievable intelligence security lapse that we saw with the inclusion of the journalist on, what was it, the Signal Group, talking about the strike on Yemen, and some of the comments that came from J.D. Vance, who seems to be absolutely determined to break the relationship between the United States and Europe. I mean, it really in quite obvious ways. But despite all of that, I think that there is still a sense in many European circles that this is a relationship that hopefully can be mended to a degree. What I think has shifted is that there won't ever be that level of trust again. That I think that this has probably given enough European countries a bit of a wake-up call that Europe really can't rely on the United States. And, this isn't something new, by the way. This isn't something we've just suddenly seen with Donald Trump in the last 2 months. I mean, it's been coming for quite a long time. That I can remember even as far back as when Barack Obama took over as president of the United States, there was a real talk about this would mark a shift towards the Pacific, that the United States was moving away from Europe. And I think we actually have seen this slowly developing. I mean, it's still a very close relationship, and I think Biden was very much more of that old school transatlanticist in his thinking. But all this is to say that what we're seeing with Trump isn't just suddenly this huge break, that one day that was an incredibly close relationship and then everything was gone. As I say, this is a change that we've been seeing, I think, for the best part of 20 years in one way or another. But obviously the way that it's happened in the past 2 months has been shocking for most people who've been seeing this and watching it. So I think we are at a really, it's very, very difficult to tell at the moment. And you highlight two different dates. I mean, obviously 2027, we've got the midterms. Will Congress go back to the Democrats? And in that case, how will that change? Will that sort of mean that there will be better oversight? Because we're just not seeing that at the moment. And again, one of the things talking about this intelligence leak that we've just seen, whether Congress will take this up, because by any account, this is an absolutely huge development. The security breach that took place there, on many levels, I would imagine that this is actually, this is breaking a number of laws, and how that will be responded. I mean, I've just literally before recording this seen that President Trump has said, "Oh, well, I knew nothing about it," and the old buck stops here. That seems a sort of dereliction of duty rather than simply saying, look, this has taken place, we will investigate it and steps will be taken. And one would expect in usual circumstances that a number of people would resign over something like this. But that hasn't. And that is also going to have a huge effect, because there will be a lot of countries now asking, can they trust their information to the United States? Now, the United States is hugely powerful in terms of intelligence gathering, but it cooperates with many other countries, and those countries now will be feeling very, very nervous. So I think what we're seeing is across the board a real damage that's been done to this relationship, and I think there will be a lot of people asking whether it can be realistically regained and salvaged in a couple of years or by 2029. But what happens, for example, if Vance then runs for the presidency and wins it? I mean, cynics would say, what happens if Trump runs for the presidency and wins it? But certainly, if you've got another Republican who comes in who has this sort of MAGA approach to things, then who knows where we're going to be. But I mean, it just seems so far off at the moment, doesn't it? But certainly from where we're standing at the moment, I think that there will be a lot of people who will hope that it can be salvaged in some way, but it won't be the same relationship. And a lot is going to happen. And I think Europe is going to be taking a much more independent view on its foreign policy, certainly, as I say, in the months and years ahead. Ninja Dolphin 1 asks, to what degree do you think Western interventions in the Middle East and North Africa played a role in eroding the rules-based order and emboldening Russia in its actions in Georgia and Ukraine? Thank you very much for this, because I think this is something that it's a really, really important question, and it's one that I think that in the West we haven't really grappled with. And I felt very uncomfortable for a long time. So regular viewers of the channel will know that, I tend to take a sort of a fairly strict legalist perspective on international relations for all sorts of reasons, but partly because I think it offers us the best chance for order and a set of rules that everyone can abide by. And I do genuinely believe, not just in the Middle East and North Africa, but I think in other cases, that the West has played a very, very significant role in undermining that. And there's no getting around it. Now, I think we can argue that many Western decision makers took these decisions with the best of intentions. Again, there will be those who will scoff at that and just say, oh, what a joke, it was whatever. All right, yeah, maybe in some cases, but in others, I think there was a sense that they were acting for the best of intentions. But I think it has caused absolute havoc with the international system, and that it has opened the door for what we're seeing now in Ukraine, and I think potentially in other situations. And it does something, it does really worry me. And I think that this is a conversation that Western policymakers haven't had, didn't reflect enough on before, that what they were doing. And I think this was really, so I remember very clearly the late 1990s and early 2000s. I actually remember very clearly the end of the Cold War. I was just finishing school when it happened, and was at first year of university. So, it was very much formative for me. And thinking that, we all felt that this was a new international order that was developing, that it was going to be a time when conflicts could be dealt with robustly, that people couldn't hide behind ideas of sovereignty. We saw this in Kosovo. Then we saw the responsibility to protect doctrine, which sort of essentially said that countries could not hide behind sovereignty and commit human rights abuses, that just wasn't going to be allowed anymore. And so it was a great hope, but I think there was a lot of abuse that went on in that. And I think that it did open the door, that this was a time of hubris for the West, that they felt they could do anything. They felt that they were doing it for the best of intentions, that they were stepping in and stopping human rights against, the actions of dictators and warlords and things like that. But it was a time when the West was in a very strong position. And I remember thinking, what happens if that starts to change? What happens if other countries start to emerge? And they then say, well, look, West, you made these decisions, you took you made these choices when you were in a strong position. We weren't happy with it. Now we're going to take that, that precedent that you've created. And I remember very, very clearly feeling that this was something that I felt that we should be very nervous about, and it has been really worrying to see the way that it's developed. So I think, to answer your question, that yes, I think that we have to accept that a lot of what the West did, as I said, even though people would say it was done with the best of intentions, and they'd say, well, if we didn't act, then there would have been all sorts of other crises and things like that, maybe, but I also think that we didn't have that proper conversation about the wider implications of what was happening, and we have opened the door to an erosion of international law altogether. And that, I have to absolutely emphasize, is not in any way a justification for what we've seen Russia do in Ukraine, or other countries that are breaking international law. Absolutely not. I treat all of it, with utmost seriousness. But I do believe that we can draw gradations on this. I've often talked about this and said, and I've put other videos up which explain why what Russia is doing in Ukraine goes far beyond anything what we saw with Iraq, what we've seen with Libya and other cases, that it really, really, what Russia has done in Ukraine is fundamentally undermine international law in an extremely dangerous way. But again, that doesn't excuse the fact that the West also did its part in undermining that international law and opening the way for, I think, many of the problems that we're seeing at the moment. Catmint 309 asks, with the possible rise in annexations in the coming future, will we see an increase in quasi and breakaway states with the intent of annexation by a larger neighbour? For a very long time, we lived with the idea that states just can't come in and seize the territory of other countries. In actual fact, since 1945, it's been remarkably rare that we've seen that. Now, not all annexations are quite the same. I'd argue they're probably all the same in terms of ultimate end result seriousness, but they come at it in different ways. So, for example, what we've seen, for example, with Indonesia annexing East Timor and eventually giving it up, what we saw in terms of Indonesia annexing West Papua, or we saw with Morocco annexing Western Sahara. India annexing Goa, interestingly, is a case that's often not mentioned. These are interesting cases in a colonial setting, where a colonial power withdrawing and the neighbouring state effectively said, right, okay, that is territory that we rightfully believe belongs to us and we will seize it. That's not justifying it for one moment, but it's actually saying that, this is what's been going on. And of course, the other big one that we've seen in this is what we're seeing at the moment with Israel and the Palestinian territories. And for anyone who's been following this, the International Court of Justice handed down a very important ruling in the summer of 2024, which in effect said that Israel, well, not in effect, it did say that Israel is in the process of annexing the West Bank. So these are colonial situations which are slightly different from cases such as what we've seen with Russia and Ukraine, where one sovereign state actually marches in and seizes the territory of another sovereign state and says, right, that is now ours. That has actually been incredibly rare in international relations since 1945. There have been 3 clear-cut cases that we can immediately sort of think of. So one of those was the case of Israel and the Golan Heights. So after the war with Syria, with the Arab states, when it seized that in 1981, that was deemed to be illegal. And actually, I hear a lot of people sort of saying, the West condemns, Russia's annexation of eastern Ukraine. Why isn't it doing it with Golan? Well, go back and look. There is a Security Council resolution which did condemn it. So that's absolutely, that's on the books. And interestingly enough, under the previous Trump administration, the United States broke ranks with the rest of the international community and did recognize the Golan as Israeli territory. We also saw in 1990 when Saddam Hussein tried to seize Kuwait, and then obviously there was the war against that. And then what we've seen in the case of Ukraine and Russia, not just marching into those territories and, as it would previously do, say, well, look, these are frozen conflicts. In effect, we're holding on to it. There might be a peace agreement in the future. Moscow actually said, no, this is now formally Russian territory. And I think that has been a huge change. And I think one of the things that we all need to be really worried about, and this is a point that I just keep banging on about, but I think it is incredibly important, is that in any Ukraine settlement, if that annexation of territory is recognized, it will be disastrous for international law because it will create a precedent that we haven't seen. And again, people would say, but what about Golan? Yeah, that is being deemed illegal. There is a Security Council resolution that says that Israel had no right to seize Golan Heights. It's not recognized under international law. We didn't see that. Saddam Hussein was forced from Kuwait. But as part of this deal that the United States is working on with Russia, if that includes a territorial element, which seems to be the case, it will be incredibly dangerous. And I think, like many others, I was really, really concerned with the comments from this Stephen Witkoff, who is Trump's negotiator, and the comments that have been coming out of the White House, which would seem to suggest that there's some sort of territorial agreement that's on the table. And I think, as I say, it would be incredibly dangerous. And I think that it will open the way for many more of these sort of cases. So I think the point that you raise about will we see a possible rise in annexations in the coming future is something that I genuinely worry about, and I think it will upset the entire international order, and it will have all sorts of knock-on effects. Because, as I again, what I'm often keen to point out is that a lot of the borders in Africa they've always been accepted. People haven't always liked them, but they've said that we'll accept them. Because they don't want to upset that sort of international order. But if that starts to go out the window and it starts to kick off in Africa, then we will be looking at all sorts of wider international impacts. And if people think that isn't going to touch them, once you get the migrant flows from these conflicts, we already see it. This will be a huge international problem that won't stop at the borders of the African continent. It will go far beyond that. So I think that this is something that is incredibly important, and why I think, I still hope that we can somehow preserve international law and try and get back to that old order, but it is looking really difficult as things stand at the moment. So, channel member Custis Standish, 1961, says, is the rich-poor divide amongst the world's nations growing or shrinking? If increasing, will this lead to the inevitable collapse of the world's economy? So this is a really great question, and thanks so much for asking it, because I think it's incredibly important, and it's an interesting question on all sorts of levels, and the answer is a little bit complicated. So essentially, the view of economists is that the income divide has in actual fact been shrinking. But it gets a little bit more complicated than that, because essentially what we've seen is that some of that has been driven by rapid economic growth in certain countries. Two key countries, of course, China and India, especially China. I mean, it's often pointed out that the number of people lifted out of poverty in China has been phenomenal, and it's been very interesting to see how that's happened. You can argue that it comes with all sorts of social costs and things, but nevertheless, that has changed quite significantly, that balance. Same with India. India is obviously growing rapidly, we've seen sort of tremendous developments, and across many Asian countries, many other Asian countries have actually developed significantly in the past 2 or 3 decades. So the feeling is that the difference between the traditionally sort of very developed West and the underdeveloped global South has changed, and that there isn't quite as much inequality as there once was. But it hasn't been uniform. So what we've seen is that certain countries, again, like China, like India, have been growing rapidly, like many Southeast Asian countries, which has given the impression that this is a sort of shrinking across the board. But of course, in actual fact, what we have seen is that the West has continued to grow and outpace growth in, for example, some sub-Saharan African countries. So it hasn't been uniform, and it's a rather mixed picture. The other thing which I think is really interesting in all of this is that while we think of income inequality between countries as being really important, what we're also seeing is greater inequality emerging within countries. The gaps between the haves and the haves not, the wealthiest and the poorest, have been growing in a lot of cases. And we've seen this across the board. We've seen this, in the case of number of billionaires, for example, that's just exploded in terms. And when you start to do the breakdowns of, you take the top, the wealthiest 1% in many societies, and when you plot that against the lowest income incomes, the amount of, the percent of wealth held by that top 1% matches the percent of wealth of the bottom 20 or 30% sometimes. It's absolutely extraordinary to see that. And I think in many ways, this is something which is becoming a huge question and is feeding a lot of the problems that we're seeing at the moment. And United States is a very, very good example of this. That we are seeing at the moment a very, very important debate between the wealthiest and tax cuts for the wealthiest, and cutting social insurance and cutting many programs for the poorest in the United States. And I think these are in many ways things that are going to be a much greater source of social unrest in many countries that are going to feed, populist movements in the years ahead. So I think that this is, as I say, it's a really, really interesting question. That if you look at it on the surface, in actual fact, one of the really interesting things over the past, as I say, 20 or 30 years, and this has been a really important topic in sort of many circles, for example, within the United Nations, about trying to drop that inequality and bringing up, and reducing levels of poverty in many countries. And we have seen remarkable progress in across many states around the world. But as I said, it hasn't been even, and interestingly, it hasn't been even within societies. That even in places like China, you've brought many people out of poverty, but you can actually see that income inequality in China, which is vast, and all the effects that go with it. So, great question, and thank you so much for that. Asummations asks, do you think Canada, Greenland and the Panama Canal will be American by the end of Trump's term in 2029? Oh, gosh. What a question. Look, Canada, no. No. I think we probably give an emphatic no. I'm tempted to say, if Canada is part of the United States by 2029, we're all buggered. So, yeah, I think Canada is a stretch too far. The other two, I wouldn't be so certain about. I could very, very well see the United States make a grab at the Panama Canal and just simply say to Panama that this is just simply too important. You're giving too much of it to China. We will take over it. And then I think, I don't think that is beyond the realms of possibility. I think Greenland's a really interesting case in so many ways, because we can see that Trump is really, really ratcheting up the pressure on that. Again, as I'm talking to you, I mean, the second lady, the vice president has gone to Greenland this week against the wishes of the Greenland government, which actually I find really interesting. But I think it's maybe because they've got a US base there, they feel that they can't actually stop her from going. And then, the US National Security Advisor is also going to Greenland this week. And I guess for the same reason that the Greenland government, unhappy about it, but isn't going to stop him from doing that. All the noises that keep coming out, and in a very, very aggressive way. But it then becomes a question of how does the United States do that? And it would seem very difficult, as things stand at the moment, to see how it would do it without using some sort of military force. Now, I mean, Greenland doesn't have a big population. It's 60,000 or so. US ground troops could do that very, very easily if they want to. But obviously the wider effects on the US relationship with NATO and its European partners, or on its relationship with European countries, because I think, partners is being pushed more and more, would be absolutely enormous. I mean, this would be, Greenland remains under the sovereignty of an EU member, another NATO member. It would potentially be Article 5 under NATO, which is an extraordinary situation to be in. But, nobody's proposing going to war with the United States. So I think, what we would then have to see is a whole range of other measures. So I think my sense would be that it's certainly possible, but it would come with massive ruptures. I think Panama, in many ways, is the more likely for these reasons. I think there will be a lot of international disquiet about it, but it wouldn't be as quite as dramatic as if it went for Greenland. But yeah, it just comes back. It's amazing that we're even having this conversation and sort of even putting Canada there. But, with Trump, the way he keeps talking about this, this seems to go beyond trolling. I think in his mind, he genuinely believes that this is something that can happen. I think it is impossible to see Canada going in that direction, but certainly Greenland, very difficult, but possible. And Panama Canal, I wouldn't be entirely surprised, especially if Trump feels he needs to show the people something. That's probably the easiest of the three. Flaming Basketball Club asks, what's your opinion on the non-aligned movement? So, this is actually a really difficult question in many ways, because I sort of have a sort of sentimental attachment to non-alignment. I don't quite know why, though. I know that sounds really odd, but it's a strange thing that I'd followed the non-aligned movement and sort of worked on it. It essentially came up during my PhD studies, and I became really interested in the idea of non-alignment, what it meant, because I think, like many people, when I started out, I naturally assumed that non-alignment was essentially neutrality, and it isn't. I might have mentioned before, but I remember my PhD supervisor sort of said, "What is non-alignment?" I said, "Neutrality." He said, No. Neutrality is neutrality. Non-alignment is rather different." And the reason I've always been sort of rather keen on this in principle rather than in practice, because it hasn't worked out in quite the same way in practice, is because it's actually quite an interesting philosophical position to take, and especially at the height of the Cold War, which was to simply say that, look, you don't align, hence the name non-alignment, with one side or another. In practice, actually, many countries did align much more with one side or another, but as a philosophical position, you don't align with one or the other. What you do is you look at any given situation and then you make the decision on what stance you should take on it. Now, that might mean that you side, during the Cold War context, more with the Soviet Union on an issue. It might mean that you side more with the West on an issue, or it might mean that you would just simply say that both are wrong and you will take a different position, or you might say that you're going to be neutral on this particular matter. So it's actually a really interesting movement in international relations. But one has the question as to what place it has today and what value it has today, and what sort of value added does the non-alignment movement bring to international relations. And I think that one of the things which is really coming up and we need to pay attention to, which ties into this, is the question of the BRICS. Because the BRICS in many ways have presented itself as an alternative to the West, and it involves key members of the non-aligned movement. And so one starts to then question exactly how that works. What is the place of non-alignment, alignment and the non-aligned movement when you've got the BRICS developing, and with many non-aligned countries which are actually sort of quite closely tied to the West. So I think from a historical point of view, it's a very interesting movement. But I'm just not quite sure what place it has in the modern world and where it can make a name for itself in what we're seeing taking place at the moment. And I would have hoped that in actual fact it would have taken a much stronger position on Ukraine. Ukraine is not a NATO member, but the fundamental principles that we're seeing playing out in Ukraine of another country invading and attacking Ukraine, Russia invading and attacking Ukraine, would have been something that non-aligned countries would have simply said, look, this is a violation of sovereignty. We don't think that this is acceptable in international relations. Countries should be free to make their own decisions on their foreign policy. and sort of have voiced much greater criticism than I think they have. And so I as I say, I think in a historical sense it's very interesting, but I just can't quite place what it does now, where its value really lies. But if anyone's got any thoughts on this, please do drop them in the comments below. I'd be fascinated to hear. MJN 808 asks, should people studying to work for or currently working in the US State Department abandon ship and find work elsewhere because of the cataclysmic shift in US foreign policy? This is really great question, because I think I can imagine that, a number of people watching this might be interested in pursuing careers in diplomacy. And there might even be a few who are diplomats who might be watching this. And I think that one of the things that you realise is that, and I've been very fortunate to see this very, up close in the case of the the UK Foreign Office, is the level of professionalism that many diplomats, or practically all diplomats in actual fact, I've ever met have, that they understand that certainly in democratic systems, that civil servants, including diplomats, have to take the instruction of their political masters. What they're told to do, they enact, even if this is something that fundamentally goes against their own personal inclinations. And I think this is very admirable in many ways. But at the same time, I think that when you're confronted with the sorts of things that we're seeing in the United States at the moment, I think there will be many US officials who will be asking themselves whether this is something, the policies that they're being asked to implement just go so far against what their core beliefs are, that whether this is something that they can remain in place. Now, this is where you get into really difficult territory, because there will be those who will simply saying, I can't go through with this. I cannot. This goes against everything I stand for. There will be others who will simply say, well, I don't like it, but this is the will of the American people, and I will enact the policies of President Trump. You will have others who will say, not simply, but they will say, I don't like this at a personal level. I don't like carrying it out, but it's important that we do look beyond. And it comes back to the earlier question I answered about, where things go in the future. And I think that there will be a lot who will be saying that, look, hopefully one day this will be over. The United States will need to rebuild its ties with the rest of the world, that it will need a good core of diplomats to be able to do this, and I want to stay around and be in a position to do that when that day comes. So I think it's a very difficult one. I mean, it's not something that I'm going to recommend one way or another. I can see the arguments in from all three perspectives. And it will very much be personal choice. I remember what was very interesting, though, was during Trump 1, which was a very different presidency if we think back. Very disorganized. There were a lot of US diplomats who just simply said, look, I'm not going to stick around for this. So you actually had a number of very senior, very experienced diplomats who just said, I will take retirement, whether that's sort of, early retirement or whether they said, right, okay, I'm out of here. And that was a real problem for the State Department. And it will be very interesting to see the figures that come out of this. We have to wait a little while to see what those are, but it will be fascinating to see what, and some of the early indications that I've seen is that they have seen a lot more people leaving, either resigning or retiring, than they would have expected at this point already. And we're only a couple of months into it. So I think it's going to be fascinating to see. And if they're replaced, because of course we're seeing all the cost cutting that's going on with Doge at the moment, or whether the United States just simply says, right, okay, we're going to cut back our foreign budgets. There's already indications that they're going to be closing down lots of embassies, lots of consulates, so cutting back on diplomatic presence. And by the way, just as a really interesting thing is that China has recently overtaken the United States for the number of overseas diplomatic posts, which is a fairly substantial moment, I think, in international relations, because traditionally the United States had the widest network, and Beijing has now overtaken it, in terms of the Chinese presence internationally. So I think this is a really, really important question as to where things go. But in terms of advocating one way or another, I mean, it's very much a question of conscience as to how people feel about this, whether they feel that entering the diplomatic service, if this is something they would feel comfortable of just simply saying, I am enacting the democratic, following the democratic principle in the United States, even though I think we need to ask some very serious questions at the moment about those principles, or whether people would just simply say, look, I can't defend this, so I don't want to join the State Department, or if they're already in, they want to leave. But it's as I say, I think it's going to be very, very interesting to start seeing how these figures break down. And I think that US diplomacy, like so much else at the moment, is going to take a real hit from everything we're seeing at the moment. David Landon Cole asks, is there any good news in IR at the moment? David, I know I think for many of us looking at international relations, it's hard to get our heads around what's going on at the moment, and it is really, really worrying. I mean, I think even last year in 2024, we were starting to see some real sort of indications that the world was going seriously awry, that we would, with the continuation of the war in Ukraine, the fact that North Korea was signing up with the Russians, that Iran and Russia had built a much closer relationship. I mean, there were already talk of a third world war and everything like that. And I think at the time we felt that this was hyperbole, that it was exaggeration. But we could see that something very serious was happening. But now I think it's just the chaos that exists that, makes many of us feel so very worried about the state of the world. But I've always considered myself an optimist, and I think that there are good news stories. I think that what we are actually seeing is that for all the problems that are emerging, I think that this is forcing countries to rethink how they need to cooperate with each other. And so, for example, just this morning, I saw some latest polling which showed that support for the European Union within the EU member countries is now at I think it said it was a record high. So a few years ago, it was like 51% support. It's now running at 74%. And what was really interesting is that the number one factor driving that was security. So I think that maybe this is driving the idea of European unity and giving Europeans a greater sense that they need to work much more closely with one another. And that's a welcome pushback on that populism, on that negative sort of views of the far right, which is trying to promote hostility across the board. For the UK, I think that what we're seeing is also a shift towards a recognition of just what a mistake that Brexit was, and that maybe this is opening the door slowly for Britain to, if not rejoin the European Union, at least form the sort of close relationship that it is absolutely makes every sense in the world economically, from a security point of view, in terms of cooperation across the board, for research, for you name it. I and I keep coming back to this. I do think that that's really important. So I think that this is all stuff that is very valuable. And I think that, even though we're seeing a break with the United States on many levels, I think the fact that Europe and Canada, for example, and I think there are other Western countries which will also be sort of making them realise the system that we have and how we need to preserve and work with one another. So I would like to think that there are good news elements in even in all of this chaos. We're in a very, very bumpy patch, and I'm not saying that, we'll necessarily get through this in the best of ways, but I like to think that we will, one way or another. And that, so I think there's a lot of reason we can be gloomy, but I don't think we should be gloomy, if you see what, if you see the difference between those 2 points. I think, and as I always say, I think there is still, and this is potentially a disaster, of course, in the United States. But, up until certainly very recently, I've also been thinking that technological advancement has been incredible, and we're living in a very, very exciting time, and there's all sorts of, interesting things going on. By the way, as a little insight into, so when I'm not doing international relations stuff, I absolutely fascinated by physics. I have to say, though, partly because I would never have been a physicist. I could never have been a physicist. I am absolutely atrocious at maths. I mean, like you wouldn't believe. But I am in awe of physicists, both, at the particle physics right up to astrophysics, and very often at night these will be the YouTube videos that I watch, and I'm absolutely fascinated in, and there is so many fascinating developments there, that with the James Webb Telescope, and many of the findings and all sorts of things, and I'm still in absolute awe of what science is doing, and many of the breakthroughs that we're seeing, and things. So sometimes I think, and I don't want to put anyone off watching my channel, but sometimes it's actually good to go and have a look at some of that, and take your brain away from a lot of what is happening in a very, very tumultuous world, and be reminded that there are so many interesting things going on out there, and good news stories and interesting stories, and where humanity is showing the best of itself, and what we can achieve, and maybe not to dwell too much on the negative. Hopefully it will pass. I think we are at a really bleak time in many ways, but I think there are out there a lot of positive stories to come from it. So go out there, look after yourselves. We live in an era where people do need to be taking good care of their mental health. It is very stressful, and we will know people around us who are also sort of finding this very, very difficult times to deal with. Look after them. But as I say, I think try and remain optimistic. There is a lot of amazing stuff going on out there. Unfortunately, I think that's all we have time for this video. Many thanks to everyone who sent in questions. I really and truly appreciate it. And apologies to everyone whose questions I couldn't tackle this time. By the way, if you want to submit questions in the future, please keep an eye on the community tab. I post regular calls there. In the meantime, here are some more videos that you might like. And thanks so much for watching, and see you in the next video.